I worked as a handyman for 31 years, and the one thing that work taught me is that people don't see the man fixing their walls. They see the problem getting fixed. That's it. You become part of the furniture. The guy with the toolbox, the truck in the driveway, the invoice slid under the door. I never minded it much. Invisibility has its uses. I retired at 62 after my knees started complaining louder than my clients. My wife, Carol, passed 4 years before that. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. And after I stopped working, the silence in our house in Barrie got so thick I could barely breathe through it. My daughter, Sophie, called every Sunday. She'd moved to Toronto for work, doing something in financial compliance that I never fully understood, but was very proud of. She had her mother's patience and her mother's laugh, and sometimes when she called, I'd hold phone a little longer than I needed to just to hear her talk. She met him at a company event. His name was Derek Holt. She brought him home for Thanksgiving. This was about 2 years after I retired, and he sat at my kitchen table in a blazer on a holiday weekend, cutting his turkey with very deliberate movements, and told me he was a director of strategic development at a logistics firm downtown. I nodded and passed him the cranberry sauce and smiled at my daughter, who was looking at him the way Carol used to look at the first crocuses of spring. He was polite enough that night, charming, even. He talked about travel, Prague, Lisbon, some resort in the Maldives, and asked me exactly 2 questions about my life, both within the first 10 minutes, after which he seemed satisfied that he'd covered the necessary ground and moved on to other topics. I always notice, but Sophie glowed, and I thought, maybe I'm reading into things. Maybe I'm just a lonely old man who doesn't trust easily anymore. So I kept quiet, and I kept watching, and I tried to give the boy the benefit of the doubt. About 8 months after that Thanksgiving, I decided I needed something to do. My doctor suggested volunteering. My neighbor suggested golf. I signed up with a home repair cooperative, a not-for-profit that did basic maintenance work for seniors and low-income families across Barrie and some of the surrounding areas. They didn't pay much, just enough to cover gas and lunch, but it got me out of the house 3 or 4 days a week, and it reminded me that I was still useful, that I still knew how to do things that mattered. One of the coordinators at the co-op mentioned they had a connection with a corporate facilities company that occasionally needed experienced tradespeople for light renovation work at office buildings in the city. Contract by contract, nothing permanent. I took a few of those jobs too, mostly downtown Toronto. A bathroom retile here, some drywall repair there. I'd drive down in the morning and be home by evening. It broke the week up nicely. That's how I ended up in Derek's building. The job was a 2-week contract to repair water damage in the executive suite on the 14th floor of a glass tower on Bay Street. Burst pipe in the ceiling, December, the kind of repair that looks minor on paper until you open the wall and discover the previous contractor cut every corner in the book. My partner on the job was a younger fellow named Marcus, 26, who just gotten his certification. Good kid. Quiet. We worked well together. I didn't know it was Derek's building when I took the contract. I didn't even know Derek worked on Bay Street. Sophie had mentioned downtown, and I hadn't asked which building because I hadn't thought it mattered. I found out on the 3rd morning. Marcus and I were setting up our equipment near the service elevator, just off the main lobby, when I saw him. Derek walked in through the front doors in a charcoal wool coat, coffee in one hand, phone pressed to his ear with the other. He had the same deliberate walk I remembered from Thanksgiving, measured like he was aware of his own entrance. A woman at the reception desk smiled at him, and he waved without looking at her. He walked right past me. I was 3 feet away, crouching to open my tool bag. He stepped around me the way you step around a puddle, automatic, unhesitating, eyes still on his phone. He had no idea who I was. I sat there for a moment after he disappeared into the elevator. Then I looked at Marcus, who was reading something on his phone and hadn't noticed any of it. I went back to unpacking my tools. I want to be clear about something. I didn't plan what happened next. I wasn't running some scheme. I was just a 64-year-old man doing a contracting job, and the man my daughter intended to marry happened to work in the same building. That's all it was, at first. But I paid attention. I'd always been good at paying attention. It's part of the work. You learn to observe a space carefully, to notice what's out of place, what doesn't fit, what's been patched over and might need revisiting. You develop a kind of patience that most people don't have anymore. Derek, it turned out, walked through that lobby twice a day. Morning arrival, end of day departure. Sometimes he'd pop down at lunch. He always had his phone going. He was one of those people who conducted his entire life at full volume in public. The kind of man who thinks his conversations are too important to be held quietly. By the end of the first week, I knew more about his work situation than I'd learned in 2 years of Sunday dinners. The first thing that unsettled me was something I heard on a Wednesday afternoon. Derek was heading out for lunch, walking past the alcove where Marcus and I were replacing a section of baseboard, and he was on the phone with someone, a colleague. By the sound of it, he was talking about a position, a promotion or something adjacent to one, a role that was coming open in the Calgary office. It makes sense on every level, he said, loud and certain. The cost of living is lower, the market's moving in the right direction, and honestly, I could use the change of pace. I've been at this office long enough. I didn't look up from my work. I heard him get into the elevator. That evening, I called Sophie for our usual Sunday call. It was actually a Wednesday, but she'd been on my mind. I asked her how things were going with Derek, how they were planning, whether she was happy. She said things were wonderful, actually. He'd mentioned they might look at buying something together in the spring, maybe in Leslieville or Riverdale, something with a backyard. She sounded excited. She'd been looking at neighborhood schools, she said, laughing, even though there's no real reason yet. I said that was lovely. I didn't mention Calgary. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Derek was just exploring options, the way people do. I told myself that. I went to bed, and I told myself that for several nights in a row. The second thing happened the following Monday. Derek came through the lobby mid-morning, on his phone again. This time the voice on the other end was a woman, sharp and businesslike, and the conversation was about a property. I caught it in pieces. 2 bedrooms. The inspection is scheduled for Thursday. Yes, the agent confirmed it's within the range. I want to move on this before the end of Q1. A property. Before the end of Q1. That was 2.5 months away. Sophie had told me last Sunday that they hadn't started looking at anything seriously yet. I set down my putty knife very slowly and listened. But he'd moved toward the door and I lost the rest of it. That night, I sat in my kitchen in Barrie with a cup of tea I didn't drink, and I thought about what I knew and what I didn't know. I thought about Derek on Thanksgiving, asking me 2 polite questions and then moving on. I thought about the way he'd stepped around me in this lobby, like I was part of the floor. I thought about Sophie looking up cost of living comparisons in Leslieville, daydreaming about backyards, while her fiancé scheduled property inspections and talked about Calgary moves. I thought about what Carol would have done. Carol would have gone directly to Sophie. She'd have sat her down, made tea, and laid it all out. Carol was braver than me in that way. She didn't worry about being wrong, because she trusted her instincts, and she trusted her love for her daughter more than she feared being mistaken. I'm not like that. I've always needed to be sure before I say something irreversible. And I knew from watching Sophie over 2 years that if I came to her with half a story and a worried face, she would close down. She'd defend him. She'd tell me I was misinterpreting things, that I'd never really given him a fair chance, that I was still grieving and projecting. She would not be wrong about all of that, but she'd also be missing something real. So I waited, and I watched, and I told Marcus the next morning that I needed to extend my hours on the job, that some of the drywall seams needed more time to cure before we could finish them. Marcus shrugged and said, sure. The thing about extended hours is you see more. You're there during the rhythms you'd normally miss. Coffee run at 10, lunch at noon. The 4:30 drift toward the elevator when people think the day is winding down. On Thursday afternoon, I was alone in the alcove. Marcus had gone to get supplies. When Derek came back in from what I guessed was the property inspection. He was on the phone and his voice was different than usual. lower, more focused. The lobby was quiet in the way it gets mid-afternoon. Just a courier at reception and a woman waiting for the elevator. "She's not going to fight it," Derek said, slowing down to check something on his phone while he talked. "You know how she is. Once I frame it as an opportunity for both of us, she'll come around. She always does." A pause. He laughed. "The job in Calgary is real. The market timing is real. It's not like I'm making it up. I just need her to feel like she's part of the decision, you know? Like she had input. She needs that." Another pause. "Look, the ring is enough for now. Once we're married, she'll settle. She'll settle into it. She doesn't want to cause problems." He got into the elevator. I had my phone in my pocket. I thought about recording. I want to be honest. The thought crossed my mind very clearly, and I almost did it. But I didn't, because I kept thinking about what happens when someone hears a recording of the person they love saying things like that. The defensiveness that kicks in. It was out of context. You don't know the full conversation. "Why were you recording him?" I'd seen it happen with my sister and her ex-husband 20 years ago. The evidence became the crime, and the actual harm got buried. What I needed wasn't a recording. What I needed was for Sophie to hear him. Not a clip, not my paraphrase. Him. I drove home to Barrie thinking about that. 2 weeks later, we finished the contract job. I thanked the facilities coordinator, packed my truck, and went back to Barrie. Marcus said we should do it again sometime. I said absolutely. I drove the 400 north with all 4 windows cracked despite it being February, needing the cold air to think. Sophie called that Sunday, her usual call, and mentioned that Derek had brought up the possibility of relocating. Calgary, specifically. A big opportunity, he'd told her, something he'd been considering for a while. She sounded careful when she said it. Careful and slightly stiff in a way I recognized from when she was 17 and trying to convince herself. She agreed with a decision she didn't fully believe in. I asked how she felt about it. She said she was still processing. It was a lot to think about. She liked her job. She had friends in Toronto. But she was trying to stay open to what was best for them as a team. I said, "Did he ask you what you thought first, or did he bring it to you already decided?" Silence. Then, "Dad." Just that. My name. Which meant, "Don't." I said, "I'm just asking. You can tell me it's none of my business." She said she appreciated my concern, but they were working through it together. She loved him. She trusted him. She was going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I said, "Okay." I said I loved her. I meant both things. After we hung up, I sat there and thought for a long time. The thing is, I understood her. I understood the mechanism of it, the way love smooths over inconsistencies, the way you construct the version of someone that fits what you need them to be. I'd done it myself years ago, in the early days with Carol, chosen to interpret her silences generously, instead of asking what they meant. Sometimes that generosity is wisdom. Sometimes it's just delay. But I'd also spent 31 years opening walls and finding what was behind them, what people had plastered over, what they'd hoped no one would look at too closely. And the thing Derek had said in that lobby, she needs to feel like she had input, she'll settle, she doesn't want to cause problems. That was not a man discussing a shared decision. That was a man discussing a management strategy. Sophie deserved to know that. But she had to hear it herself. I'd been thinking, in the weeks since the contract ended, about Sophie and Derek's engagement party. They'd set a date, mid-March, a Saturday, at a restaurant space Sophie had found in the distillery district. About 40 people, both families, close friends, colleagues. Derek's parents were flying in from Vancouver. I'd been invited, of course. I'd said I'd be there, and I'd been thinking, since February, about what the evening might allow. Derek didn't know I knew. That was the thing. He'd never once looked at me closely enough to know anything. As far as he was concerned, I was some tradesman who'd been briefly present in his building and then vanished, the way that type of person always vanishes. He had no reason to be guarded around me, and I knew things he'd never intended anyone to know. I thought about it carefully, the way I think about a repair job before I start, mapping what you're dealing with, what the right tools are, what outcome you're actually trying to achieve. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I wasn't performing a takedown. I was trying to give my daughter the information she needed to make a real choice. That's all. The party was on March 15th. I drove down from Barrie in the afternoon and found a parking spot on Trinity Street. The restaurant space was warm and candlelit, exposed brick, the kind of venue Sophie would have chosen because she has Carol's eye for atmosphere. I got there early enough to say hello to the people I knew, her friends from university, a couple of her work colleagues, an aunt and uncle from my side who'd come up from Hamilton. Derek arrived with his parents. His mother was small and precise, a retired school principal, friendly in a formal way. His father didn't say much but had a firm handshake and seemed decent enough. Derek himself moved through the room with that measured confidence, greeting people, making small talk, touching Sophie's lower back the way men do in public, when they want to signal ownership without appearing to. I watched all of it from across the room and kept my face open and my glass low, and I waited. The moment I'd been thinking about came about an hour in. The room had loosened up by then. Second drinks, laughter getting louder, people standing in relaxed clusters. Derek was holding court near the windows with a few of his colleagues, and Sophie had gone to talk to her friends across the room. Derek's parents were seated at a table with my aunt and uncle, getting along fine. I walked over to where Derek was standing. He saw me approach and shifted his expression into that polite neutral he used on people he couldn't immediately categorize. I'd seen it before, at Thanksgiving. The quick internal scan. Who is this? What do I need to do with them? Derek, I said. Good evening. Good to see you, he said with the warmth of a man who isn't certain of your name. I wanted to say congratulations properly. I shook his hand. It's a wonderful thing, an engagement, a real commitment. Thank you, yeah. It's a big step. He smiled at his colleagues with a slight shift that said, bear with me. Sophie tells me you two have been talking about some exciting changes, I said pleasantly. The move to Calgary? Something moved across his face. Quick, barely visible. We've been exploring options, yeah. Nothing finalized. Of course, it's good to plan ahead. I nodded. When did you first start seriously considering it? The Calgary position, I mean. He paused a fraction of a second longer than he should have. Just recently, he said. We've been discussing it together. Ah, I took a small sip of my drink. I only asked because Sophie mentioned it caught her a bit by surprise when you brought it up. I was glad to hear you were working through it together. Another pause. His colleagues had gone quiet in the way people go quiet when they sense something they shouldn't be watching. It came up organically, Derek said. His voice had taken on a new quality. Measured, careful, these things do. Sure, I said. And the property, did that come up organically too? Now there was no mistaking it. Something in his face went still in the way things go still before they break. What property? He said. The one you were inspecting in February, I said, keeping my voice completely even. The 2-bedroom. I believe your agent had confirmed it was within your range. The room, or at least our corner of it, had gone very quiet. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't moved from where I was standing. I simply asked the question and held it in the air between us. How do you know about that? He said. Not a question. A statement of alarm. Derek. Sophie's voice came from behind me. I turned. She'd drifted over, probably catching her name in the ambient noise of the room, that particular radar that tunes in when you're being discussed. She looked between her fiancé and her father with the expression of someone who has just stepped into a room and felt the temperature wrong. Hey, Derek said, and his voice changed again, warmer now, performing reassurance. What property? Sophie said. She'd caught the tail of it. And that was the moment I stepped back. Not metaphorically. I physically took a small step to the side, creating space, and I looked at my daughter and said quietly, I think you should ask him. She looked at me. Then she looked at Derek. What property? She said again. I watched Derek try to navigate it. He was good. I'll give him that. He had a practiced ability to reframe, to contextualize, to make the question itself seem like the problem. He started with the word look, the way people do, when they're about to explain something that doesn't need explaining. He used the words opportunity and timing, and I was going to tell you, and I wanted to have everything solid, first before I brought it to you. You know how you get when things are uncertain. I watched Sophie's face through all of it. It's a strange thing to watch your child understand something they didn't want to understand. It doesn't look like revelation. It doesn't look like anger. It looks, at first, like a kind of exhausted recognition. Like something in them has been quietly waiting to be confirmed. And now it is. And there's a strange relief inside the hurt. She asked about the Calgary conversations. When they'd started, who they'd been with. He said October, which would mean he'd been making plans for 5 months while discussing Leslieville backyards with her. She asked about the property. He said he'd just been looking. She asked if he'd scheduled an inspection for a property without telling her, and then had conversations in which he told someone she'd come around, that she always came around, that she'd settle. He asked her how she knew that. She looked at me. I said, very quietly, I was working in your building in February, the contracting job on the 14th floor. You walked past me several times. Derek's face changed in a way I'll remember for the rest of my life. It was the face of a man realizing that the world had been observing him during the months he'd believed himself unobserved. That the man he'd stepped around without looking had been his daughter's father. That every word he'd said in that lobby, every phone call conducted at full volume because he'd assumed the help wasn't listening, had been heard. You were, he started. The handyman, I said. Yes. Sophie's friends had gathered nearby now, not obviously, but present. Derek's parents, too, had come closer. The room had the quality of a place that has stopped pretending. Sophie took off her engagement ring. She didn't throw it. She didn't make a scene. She placed it very carefully in Derek's palm and closed his fingers around it, and then she turned away from him and walked toward her friends, and one of them, a woman named Priya, who'd known Sophie since university, opened her arms without being asked. I stood there for a moment. Derek was looking at the ring in his hand. His colleagues had dispersed. His father had put his hand on his own wife's shoulder and was looking at the floor. I didn't say anything else to Derek. There wasn't anything that needed saying. I found Sophie about 20 minutes later. She was in a small anteroom off the main space, a coat closet, really, with Priya and one other friend, a glass of water in her hand. When I came in, the friends gave me space, stepping out and pulling the door mostly closed. Sophie looked up at me and her eyes were wet, but her face was composed. That particular composure I recognized from her mother. The kind that doesn't break down. It just holds everything very still. Did you know, she said. When you came tonight, I knew what I'd heard, I said. I didn't know what he'd told you. Why didn't you just tell me? It was the question I'd been asking myself for 2 months. Because I didn't want you to have to decide whether to believe me, I said. I wanted you to be able to decide what you saw for yourself. She was quiet for a moment. That's very calculated. Yes, I said. I know. And very you, she said, after a moment. We sat with that for a while. From the main room I could hear voices, the adjusted hum of a party that has absorbed something difficult and is carefully continuing. I heard Derek's mother say something to someone in a low voice. I heard laughter, somewhere, unrelated. Mom would have just told me, Sophie said. Your mother was smarter than me, I said. She trusted that love could hear hard things. Why didn't you? I thought about it honestly. Because I was afraid of being wrong, I said. And afraid of what it would cost you if I was wrong. You'd have spent the rest of your life wondering if I'd driven him away. Sophie looked at me for a long time. Then she said, he was going to take me to Calgary, wasn't he? He'd decided already. The inspection was in February, I said. The property was there. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked older, not in a bad way, in the way people look when they've stopped needing to be protected from something. I knew something was off, she said. I kept explaining it away. That's what you do with people you love, I said. You find the most generous interpretation. It's not foolish. It's just human. She leaned over and put her head against my shoulder for a moment, which she hasn't done since she was very young. I put my arm around her and we sat like that in the coat closet of an engagement party that was no longer an engagement party, and outside the city hummed and the St. Lawrence River was somewhere in the dark beyond all that glass and light. And I thought about Carol, and about what it means to watch over someone you love when you have no power to protect them from anything real. You can only show up. You can only stay close enough to see, and careful enough to wait, and brave enough at the right moment to say, ask him yourself. The rest belongs to them. Sophie rebuilt her life in Toronto. She stayed in her job, which she was very good at, and she found a place of her own, a one-bedroom in Roncesvalles, with a small balcony she filled with planters in the spring. I drove down on weekends sometimes. We'd walk along the water, or find a farmer's market, or just sit in her apartment with tea and the comfortable silence of two people who no longer need to fill everything in. She dated a bit, here and there. Nothing serious, and she wasn't in a hurry. She told me once that the experience had made her more patient, which surprised her. She'd expected to feel more guarded, but instead she felt more clear. She knew now, she said, what she was actually looking for. Not what looked right, what felt honest. Derek, as far as I know, took the Calgary position. I don't know what happened to the property. I don't ask, and Sophie doesn't say. I still do the occasional contracting job with the co-op. My knees are no better, but the work keeps my mind engaged. And I like Marcus, and I like the people we help. Older folks mostly, people who need a railing reinforced or a bathroom made safer, small things that matter a great deal. It's good work. It always was. Invisible work, mostly. The kind people don't notice until something breaks, and then they're glad someone knew how to fix it. That suits me fine.